Hello, this is Ross Bliley from the podcast Pigskin Tales. This podcast is sponsored by Sterling Soap Company. With products sold throughout 41 locations around the globe, Sterling Soap Company has a unique assortment of products to choose from for your loved one for the holidays. Handmade artisan soaps created by Roderick and Amanda Lovin since 2012, these products are affordable and provide great value. Act now and save on your shipping costs. If you purchase $75 or more, your shipping cost is free in the United States. Shop now online at sterlingsoap.com.
Imagine a town forged in the fires of industry, rallying around a band of gridiron gladiators. The Pottsville Maroons weren't just a football team, they were the embodiment of a community's grit, determination, and soaring aspirations. In 1925, they clawed their way to the pinnacle of professional football, only to have it all ripped away in a controversy that still echoes throughout the halls of the NFL. A new book is out that tells the complete story of the Pottsville Maroons. It's titled Marooned: The Rise, the Fall, and the Redemption of the NFL's Pottsville Maroons. Maroon plunges you into the heart of this captivating saga with the roar of the crowd where it mingles with the clang of the coal mines. Authors Jeffrey Payne and Darren Hayes chronicled this team's rise from the humble beginnings to the gridiron dominance and everything in between. Experience the thrill of victory as the Maroons conquer their rivals, their every triumph a testament to the small-town spirit conquering the big city odds, and the fall, and how they get the redemption and try to get their championship back. It's all covered in Maroons, and you have a unique opportunity to win an autographed copy from Sports History Network and Pigskin Dispatch. The details are found for this contest at sportshistorynetwork.com, your headquarters for sports yesteryear.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Sports. Welcome to the Hello Old Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network. Your co-host Dan Newman with you as always. Andrew is having some technical difficulties here, and he's working those out as we speak. Usually you don't hear about the technical difficulties because it's just Andrew and me, but this time we're lucky and glad to once again have another great sports history author with us, fellow 19th century baseball enthusiast, and that's Jeff Orens. Jeff is here to talk about his book, Selling Baseball: How Superstars George Wright and Albert Spalding Impacted Sports in America. And Jeff, thanks so much for being with us here tonight.
Dan, it's great to be here. You know, these types of shows are always good because not enough people know about 19th century baseball and its origins and maturation and all that good stuff. And I look forward to it.
Absolutely. And thank you. Just to give a quick note as background to our listeners and to Jeff also, just in case curious, we've done a few 19th century baseball episodes in the past. We did a King Kelly episode. We did an episode on the 1890s Baltimore Orioles, and then we actually did another author, Greg Gagis, joined us a few years back to talk about his book on the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings, the book that he co-wrote. So no strangers to 19th century baseball are we on this podcast, but and Andrew is back with us. Andrew, doing well tonight?
I was until I had to deal with technical difficulties, and I don't know what's going on there, but got my phone as a backup, so we'll do it this way, and hopefully I come through okay.
Yep, everything sounds good. Jeff, why don't you kind of start off, just tell us a little bit about the book and who these guys were. Who were George Wright and Albert Spalding?
Sure. So you mentioned you had done an episode a while back on the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings. And of course, you know, that was the first team that was the all openly professional team in the sport. George Wright was really the cornerstone to that team as the star shortstop and really star everything player. He was the first superstar really back then in the late 1860s and early 1870s. His brother Harry managed the team in 1869 for Cincinnati, and he also played center field, and those two guys were great. But what was really interesting back then was there was an up-and-coming pitcher. His name was Albert Spalding, and we all know Spalding from Spalding Sporting Goods that's been around forever. But not many people know about Albert Spalding and his stellar career as a pitcher back in the late 1860s, and then him joining with Harry and George in 1871 to form the Boston Red Stockings. And those three together were really unbeatable. They were the first professional superstars, George and Albert, because George, as I said, was all everything. He could hit as well as field and do it all. But Albert was the first great pitcher in the professional league in 1871, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. We just call it the NA, the National Association. Those three, Harry, George, and Albert, formed the nucleus of the first dynasty in professional baseball. The Boston Red Stockings won 4 consecutive titles out of 5 during the time the National Association was in existence before the National League. So these guys were great. They were great for different reasons. George was a natural athlete. You gave him a ball and a bat, and he could do anything that was needed in a ball game. Defensively, he had no peer. His blazing speed, he was ambidextrous. He could catch the ball with either hand, throw it with pinpoint accuracy to first base. On the flip side, he was a ferocious hitter, both for power, drop a bunt every now and then, punch a ball through the infield. He could do it all, get on the base paths and steal a base. He was from the metro New York area, which was really the birthplace of organized baseball, as opposed to Albert, who was from the plains in the Midwest, about 90 miles southwest of Chicago, grew up, learned the game. And as he grew up, he physically grew to 6 feet 1 inches tall at a time when ball players were 5'8" or 5'9". So he towered over many of these guys, and that helped him rev up his pitches, which were all thrown back then underhand. That was the rule of the day. So in order to get some velocity, this guy, who was pretty big, had a huge backswing with his arm as he wound up to throw this pitch, and he could whiz it by you. He was only 45 feet away from the batter. We're not 60 feet 6 inches like we are today. 45 feet, which is pretty close. And then add on top of that, he's 6'1", and he was a pretty imposing figure as he's throwing the ball. But the key for these guys was they came together and they developed a team that just was better than anyone else. So it was quite a combination when you put George Wright and Albert Spalding together.
Yeah, I think 45 feet, just for anybody who's as a frame of reference, I think that's the length of like a standard Little League field. Might be 40 feet, but like 12 and under baseball, the mound is either 40 or 45 feet. So that's kind of what you're talking about. And then one note just on where you're talking about the Red Stockings team, and you mentioned it in this book, and it's the first, but certainly not the last time that there's a discussion amongst fans and writers of, is this team's dynasty killing the sport? Are they so good? Are they so good that it's hurting interest in everybody else?
And it's funny that you say that, Andrew, because Albert Spalding felt the same way. He saw, after 5 years of playing on this team, he saw that he could continue to pitch on the team for quite a while. But for him, he wanted things to be a little more evened up, a little more competitive. The Boston fans were actually losing interest in going to see their team, their hometown team, play. They didn't want to part with 25 or 50 cents for a game if they knew the outcome already. The Red Stockings were going to win. And in fact, in 1875, they won every home game that they played, which was just amazing. And Spalding said, look, it's time for me to move on. I need another challenge. And in fact, he wanted to run his own team like Harry Wright did. Harry Wright was a player manager, and Spalding wanted to be like that. If you think about today's comparison, it's Juan Soto. I mean, Juan Soto could have been a great sidekick to Aaron Judge, right? Soto would have been Lou Gehrig to Aaron Judge's Babe Ruth. Soto didn't want any part of that. I mean, he wanted his own team. He wants to lead his own organization to victory. And so Spalding felt the same way. And he moved out to Chicago because he was from the Midwest. A guy named William Hulbert, who ran the Chicago White Stockings, said, hey, we want you out here. Bring some of your buddies from the Boston team who happen to be Midwesterners, guys like Cal McVeigh and Ross Barnes, and bring them over. We'll start a new league. We'll call it the National League. And the reason they wanted to start a new league was not only because they had these great guys, but they wanted to clean up the game because the game was it was too non-competitive, number one. Number two, there was too much drinking. Guys were just off on their own, doing their thing. And if you're going to present a professional image and ask someone to pay a quarter or 50 cents to watch a game, you better clean up your act. And Spalding really felt that way, as did Hulbert. And the third thing was a lot of underground gambling. Guys who they wanted to make a buck themselves. They'll fix a game, they'll lose it so that they get a payout. And Spalding wanted none of that. So the idea of people saying, we want a professional sport to be clean, we don't want a number of drunks hanging around, and we want it to be competitive because, hey, we're plunking down some money here. And it makes a lot of sense.
So just give us a little bit of an idea. How did they first become acquainted with each other, Spalding and Wright? And then during those years where they were teammates in Boston, what was their relationship like? So
they first met in 1867, and George Wright was on a very good team from the Northeast, the Washington Nationals. And the Nationals came out to Chicago on a tour of the Midwest, and they were undefeated at the time in terms of this tour. They had won 7 games in a row, and they beat teams in Ohio and Indiana and Missouri and places where they knew they were going to win. And some of the scores were ridiculous, 100-10 and stuff like that. So, I mean, these guys, Washington Nationals with George Wright playing in the infield, they were unstoppable. Here's where they came together. In Chicago, there was a big baseball tournament in July of 1867. And Spalding's team, the Forest Cities of Rockford, Illinois, about 90 miles southwest of Chicago, came in to meet the Nationals as sort of fresh meat, if you will. Okay, these guys will be the sacrificial lambs. Washington Nationals will beat them as a warm-up to the Nationals playing the team that was supposed to be the cream of the Chicago baseball teams, the Excelsiors. Turns out, Spalding pitches the Forest Cities to a victory, big upset victory over the Nationals. And Henry Chadwick, the preeminent baseball journalist of the day, was out there covering the Nationals, and he said, wow, he said, this guy Spalding, he's amazing. And he isn't even 17 years old yet. There's a 16-year-old kid who pitches this upset victory. And that was the beginning of a rivalry that developed. Now, fast forward to 1869, a couple of years later, here's Harry Wright and George Wright, undefeated Cincinnati Red Stockings. So you know what's going to happen when they come up against Spalding. They beat them 4 games out of 4. But Spalding was improving, and each one of those losses was closer and closer. The next year, they played another 4 games against each other, Spalding pitching in each one of those 4 games. And by that last game, Spalding broke through. It wasn't because he didn't have the physical capabilities. He mentally was able to manage that game. He pitched a 6-hitter. I mean, that's almost like a no-hitter back then. The way those guys, the ball pitches a 6-hitter, and they beat the Cincinnati Red Stockings. And Harry Wright and George Wright, they saw how much this guy had improved. 1869, 1870, when the Cincinnati Red Stockings folded and the Wright brothers, Harry and George, in 1871 went to Boston, they said, we know who our pitcher has to be. It's got to be Albert Spalding. We've seen him improve. We've seen him grow, both physically to 6 feet 1 inches and mentally able to handle the challenge. And Spalding, he rewarded them every way possible. He won 204 games in 5 years. Think of how many games you have to win today to be a 200-game winner.
Yeah,
right?
it's like
Maybe,
it's 8 seasons now. Well, God, no, it's a lot more than 8 seasons. It's like
really?
14 seasons.
It's 14 or 15 seasons. If you win 20 games a year, you got to do it 10 straight years in order to win 200 games. And here's Spalding winning 204 games in 5 years. So they were great ball players, and they worked really well together. The thing about Spalding was he not only played baseball really well, he knew he wanted to do something more. And he had seen that George Wright and his brother Harry had gone into the sporting goods business in 1868. And then George brought that sporting goods business, not with Harry, but with another player on the Boston team, a guy named Charlie Gould, who played first base. They opened up a partnership, Wright and Gould, to sell sporting goods in 1871, 72. And Spalding's watching all of this, and he's saying, I know my career is going to be finite. It's only going to be X number of years. What am I going to do after that? And he said, I want to sell sporting goods. And he had a lot of time to spend with Harry and George, Harry especially, because Harry was sort of a mentor of Albert's. Harry was 12 years older than George. He was 15 years older than Albert. And Harry retired from pitching and playing the outfield in 1873, and he managed full time. And he was giving managerial tips to Spalding, but he also was answering his questions, as George was, about sporting goods. How do you get involved in this? What makes sense in terms of opening up a business? So these guys were, I wouldn't say best buddies, but they certainly were friends related to swapping stories about baseball, creatively thinking about how to be a better team and how teamwork can develop, and then maybe talking about sporting goods and what are you going to do as a next step in that area. And so 1871 to 75 was it was just a learning experience from beginning to end for Spalding. It was a great situation for the Wright brothers because Boston was on top of the world and they were, right, the premier manager, premier player. So it couldn't have been much better.
I think the thing with the sporting goods that we just need to emphasize, this is the 1870s. Like, the Civil War ended 5 years ago. Like, it seems natural to us now that, oh, of course there were sports, so there was a sporting goods industry. But they were essentially inventing an industry and convincing people that they needed to spend what little money they had on, golf clubs eventually and things to improve, their hobby and convince them, oh, you need to learn how to play croquet, and it's kind of revolutionary if you think about it.
No question. And I mean, the title of my book sort of says it all, Selling Baseball. You're selling the concept of playing a better game of baseball, but at the same time, you're selling people on the implements to play it and convincing them, hey, you need better equipment in order to play a better game, or you need more equipment. Remember, what was the equipment back in the 1860s? Let's see. You needed a ball and a couple of bats and 4 bases. That was it. Even a uniform. The guys who played baseball in the 1850s and 1860s, they didn't have any uniforms. They wore long workman's pants, a shirt, and a cap. It's what people wore when they played cricket, which was the game of bat and ball before baseball. And then in the late 1860s, Harry Wright comes up with this idea. He's going to take the baseball world by storm. We're going to dress these guys in a uniform. And it's going to be not long pants. It's going to be knickered short pants with these crazy long hosiery stockings that you pull up, to your knee. And we're going to make a statement about baseball. It's different than cricket. Look at even what we wear. And from that time, what happened? There wasn't just a ball that you'd use in a game. Every team needed a ball for a game. And by the way, back then, 1860s, the ball lasted the whole game. You played with it because they were so rare. Then in the 1870s, they started to mass manufacture these things for teams that were proliferating after the Civil War. Everyone needed a baseball now. And the public was even starting to buy baseballs. So baseballs, bats were handcrafted by a wood turner who was making legs for wooden tables. Oh yeah, I'll make a bat also, right? And you can use that. Well, teams needed bats, and every once in a while you'd break them, and they'd need more. Just the sheer numbers started to develop, and then, wonder of wonders, let's protect the players. They didn't have any protective equipment. There was no such thing as a catcher's mask, a glove, and a glove was first used not to catch the ball because you want to, it's not an extension of your hand like today's glove. It was a protective bit of equipment. It was a workman's glove with the fingertips cut off that gave some padding to your palm so that it wouldn't be continually bruised or potentially busted up by a ball or a slide or whatever you did. So the idea of gloves, the idea of a catcher's mask to protect the catcher, the most dangerous position in the sport at that time was catcher. In fact, you didn't play catcher right up behind the batter. Very few people did. Most catchers played 10 feet behind the batter. They actually wanted to let the ball drop and catch it before they put it in play, until people started to steal bases and they said, oh my God, I can't be 10 feet behind the batter. I got to come right up to where the batter is so I can have a chance at throwing these guys out. Well, you can imagine a foul tip hitting the guy in the face with no catcher's mask, busted nose, bruised and battered eyes, and all sorts, broken teeth. Catcher's mask in the 1870s was the next thing. But Andrew, your statement about people paying money, not only to watch the game, if they're going to play it, they got to buy the equipment. So Spalding saw it, the Wright brothers did, and they made good money out of that.
Yeah, to me, the catcher thing, and that's always been the thing when I'm like explaining to people who don't know much about the origins of baseball in the 19th century. When I said, I'll say, oh yeah, and they didn't wear gloves for the first several decades, and people can kind of see that and go, all right, that I get. And then I go, not even the catcher, and then people go, whoa, like it's hard to imagine that there ever was anything that looked like baseball that involved the catcher not wearing a glove, let alone a mask and a chest protector.
Amazing. And that took, as you say, years to develop. Even in the professional sport, you weren't considered manly if you used these pieces of equipment. Spalding changed all that in 1876. He was pitching, and he stopped pitching in 1876 because he couldn't master the curveball, which was coming into vogue in the mid 1870s. Couldn't master the curveball. He was a player manager, Chicago White Stockings. He led him to the first National League championship in 1876. He did not pitch after 1876. He won 47 games that year, and he took himself out of pitching. And the next year, he only played first and second base. Why? Couldn't throw a curveball. When he was on first base, he said to himself, man, I gotta have a glove. People are throwing me the ball constantly. My hand is killing me. And he knew that from being a pitcher, just getting the ball thrown back to him from the catcher, the continual pounding in your hand. And what he did, which was revolutionary, he was a marketing genius. anyone who wore a glove back then, and there were very few, they wore flesh-colored gloves. So in the stands, you really couldn't pick out, is this guy wearing a glove? And I don't know. And here Spalding comes along and he says, I'm going to wear a jet black colored glove so that everyone who's in those stands can see Albert Spalding has a glove on. And the idea was to connect his, heroic presence as Albert Spalding, the star pitcher, and now first baseman. He's wearing a glove. And the light bulb went on with some of these spectators. Hey, wait a minute. Maybe I should wear a glove. Maybe that would be good so that, I don't damage my hand. I don't break a bone. I don't, whatever it is. It started to develop quickly from there. Catcher's mask, the same thing. The idea of wearing a catcher's mask. I mean, catchers, they try it on. They take it off. They throw it to the side. They say, I can't see through this thing. It's, it just blocks my vision or whatever. Well, it doesn't take too many balls to hit you in the nose, to hit you in the eye, where it sort of sinks in. Maybe I should be using a piece of protective equipment. And that's what equipment was back then. It was all protective. And then from there, it became a weapon, especially a glove. I mean, look at the glove outfielders have right now. It's unbelievable, the size of that thing, but it's allowed. You can do it. So it was just Spalding and George Wright saw the potential here with equipment, and they capitalized on it in a big way.
One of the things that I think is interesting here is that, and I don't, coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, these two guys are the pioneers of the two longest continuous franchises in Major League Baseball. The what are founded as the Boston Red Stockings go through several evolutions in Boston over the next 80 years or so, and are today's modern day Atlanta Braves. And then the Chicago White Stockings are actually the forerunners of the Cubs, which can be a little confusing because there's also a White Sox in Chicago. And that to me is very interesting. The fact that, those two guys, these two earliest pioneers, end up being the cornerstone for two franchises that last for, going on a century and a half now. I want to talk a little bit about 1876 because it's also the first year of the National League. And as you mentioned, Spalding, he goes to Chicago. He wins the pennant as the pitcher manager. This 1876 Chicago White Stockings team, the first ever National League champion, this is one of the all-time great teams, really in general, but of 19th century baseball. You got a Hall of Famer at catcher in Deacon White. You got a Hall of Famer at third base in a young 24-year-old Cap Anson. Al Spalding, as you mentioned, who's in the Hall of Fame, maybe more as a pioneer than as a player, but still, he's a Hall of Famer. And in those days, a pitcher was an everyday player. This wasn't the type of thing that was like an every 3 or 4 days type of thing. And then you've got two other guys in the infield, Cal McVeigh and Ross Barnes, who probably could be Hall of Famers in their own right. So just talk a little bit about some of the great players of that 1876 White Stockings team.
Well, there's no question that Ross Barnes should be in the Hall of Fame. The reason he isn't is because technically he doesn't have 10 years of major league experience to be able to qualify. Now, that's a technicality that the Veterans Committee has overlooked for other players. Ross Barnes should be in the Hall of Fame. Ross Barnes, in 1876, hit over 400 for the third time in 5 years. He had hit over 400 in 1872 and 73, 76. He does it again. He has a stellar year. He led the league in batting and in all sorts of batting categories. But not only was he a great hitter, he was as good a second baseman as George Wright was a shortstop. So that when they were on the Boston team, that was a combination that was unlike any other, Barnes and George Wright. Well, he was a great infielder in Chicago as well. And the problem for Ross Barnes that helped lead to a quick downfall was not only was he a good hitter in terms of hitting for power, but he did something that most other players weren't as good at, and that was fair foul hitting, which was hitting a ball that lands fair in the infield and with its spin carries outside either the first or third baseline before it reaches the base. Now, you know, the rule now, if that happens, it's a foul ball. But back then it wasn't. And if he's going to lay down what looks like a bunt, but it has tremendous spin on it, and once it hits the infield, it just takes off. You're going to have infielders running themselves crazy trying to get this thing and get Ross Barnes out. His combination of being able to hit for power, being able to hit like that, he was unstoppable. 1877, as with most games that are maturing, rules change. And they made an easy rule change. They said, that's no longer allowed, fair foul hitting. It's going to be a foul ball if it rolls foul before it goes past third or first. And Ross Barnes, his average went from 476 into the mid 200s. I mean, it was a natural that was going to happen, right? And then from there, he developed an illness. A couple of years later, he was out of baseball. So here's a guy who should be in the Hall of Fame who wasn't. Now, take a look at a guy who was very young, but was a great ball player, is Paul Hines. Paul Hines was on the team, and Paul Hines would become another guy who should be in the Hall of Fame, but is not. He went on to go to the Providence Grays, 1879, won a world championship with them, and George Wright, who was their player manager. So here's a young guy who's playing. Joe Start, first baseman, a talent in terms of just dependable. He wasn't Lou Gehrig, but he was a Lou Gehrig type of character in terms of day in and day out playing great baseball. He was the first baseman who basically went along to the Providence Grays as well. He was older then. He was in his late 30s. He was in his mid 30s in the 76 game. But you add up all these guys who could have been Hall of Famers with guys like Cap Anson and Deacon White and Albert Spalding. You had a team that pretty much was Hall of Fame caliber at most of the positions. So it was a great team. And the thing about Spalding was he knew how to manage that team in 76 to bring these guys a championship because it was about teamwork. And basically, they didn't win another championship until the early 1880s because Spalding dropped out as a manager the next year after 77. And that was sort of a teamwork situation that started to fray at the edges for the Chicago White Stockings in the late 1870s. So they didn't put it all together again until Spalding was the administrator who ran the club as president, and Cap Anson became manager in the early 1880s and turned them into a dynasty for the 1880s.
So, and then the other thing that I wanted to sort of mention as far as like a team is concerned, you mentioned George Wright. He leaves Boston in the late 1870s and goes and manages Providence for just 1 year, right?
That's exactly right. And he left because, sort of like Spalding, he didn't have any other worlds to conquer. I mean, he'd done everything that he wanted to do in Boston. The only thing he hadn't done was manage a team. And so he leaves Boston after the 1878 season. The Providence Grays are looking for a manager. They're a solid club, and they finished third that year in 78, and they wanted to upgrade. And this was the upgrade that they were looking for. If they could get him to play shortstop and manage the team, and oh, by the way, he brings a young Jim O'Rourke, a future Hall of Famer, with him from Boston. Now you have the nucleus of a team that's going to have a winning pedigree. And you add into that Paul Hines, and you add in Joe Start, and a rookie pitcher in 1878 who blossoms in 1879, John Montgomery Ward, who wins 47 games. And all of a sudden, you've got a powerhouse to the team. And George Wright wins that pennant. And he says, well, I've done everything I want to do now. I want to go back to Boston. That's where my sporting goods business is, and end up my career with the Red Stockings for another year or two. And the Providence Grays say, well, that's nice, but you can't do that. and he said, what? And they said, well, what's happened here is baseball has changed administratively. We have this thing called the reserve system, and each team in the National League can pick 5 players and say they're on reserve, and they can only negotiate with the team that they're on, who's put them on this system. And if they don't want to negotiate, they have to sit out a year. They can't play professional Major League Baseball. They could play in the minors if they wanted to, but playing for the Boston Red Stockings in 1880 for George Wright, that was a non-starter. The Grays wouldn't allow it. So he was the only, he said, fine, I'm quitting. I'm not playing. I'm sitting out the year. He was the only manager who, in his only year of managing in the professional baseball leagues, won a title. For 1 year. He managed for a year. He won a title. Spalding managed for 2 years. He won 1 title in 76, but he didn't win it in 77. So George Wright has this distinction in a number of different ways. Good that he won the title in his only year of managing. He was the first victim of the reserve system. And so, it sort of cuts both ways, right? How long did it take to break the reserve clause?
95 years.
Yeah, right. It took a while, right?
It's interesting because you hear so much of the history of labor relations in baseball through the lens of the reserve clause, which is obviously, accurate, I think. But it's interesting to think that there was a time before the reserve clause. And I'll be honest, and I knew this, but not in as much detail as you provided. The thing that the pre-reserve clause baseball most reminded me of is what we have now in college athletics, just the last 4 or 5 years with the transfer portal, where it's basically just unfettered free access. To me, there's a lot of people who go, oh, well, this is when baseball became business. This is when baseball became big business. You can say in 1869, with the Reds being a fully professional team, it became business. To me, the sign it became big business is the reserve clause, when it started to get treated like every other big business in the 19th century, which was that the moguls, barons, whatever you want to call them, running it, said, we're going to exert total control over it.
It's a system of collusion, right? We're going to collude, and we're going to make sure that these guys don't have the opportunity to sell their services to anyone else but who we want. And the owners, they were desperate to do this, because even though through the 1870s, baseball was growing and the quality of play was getting better, all sorts of good stuff, no one was making any money. And the whole idea of playing just for bragging rights of the city or the league that you're in, that wasn't cutting it anymore with the investors. The investors said, well, where's my return on what I gave you? I invested this money and there's no money coming back. And the owner said, what's the biggest expense out there? Oh, it's the baseball players' salaries. What can I do about that? Oh, I have an idea. I'll get together with all the other owners. We'll collude and we'll make it impossible for the top 5 guys to earn more than we want them to. I mean, it was a foolproof system. Now, remember, the Sherman Antitrust Act hadn't come into play until 1890. Sherman Antitrust Act was put in place to bust up these types of monopolies and collusion and all that. And it really didn't get any teeth until 1901, when Teddy Roosevelt decided he was going to go after businesses. But baseball had turned into just like any other robber baron type of sport. We'll collude, we'll make money, public will be happy, let's go for it.
Yeah.
And it really is amazing. And look, just to be even-handed about this, I think there's certainly plenty of things to criticize the modern MLB Players Union for, but it really is amazing to me that this was able to go on through the days of Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, and basically, Mickey Mantle, after winning the Triple Crown in 1956, would have had two choices: either sign for whatever George Weiss and the Yankees wanted to give him, or not play baseball. It's just, that's the crazy thing to me, is that it's like you realize that, and from what I can just sort of pull up out of my memory, nobody really that big ever did it. I guess Babe Ruth did some crazy things in his day, trying to leave the team when he didn't feel like he was being respected. But all these guys, like, they were trapped. I mean, what would have happened if after Mickey Mantle won the Triple Crown in 1956, they tried to cut his salary in half? What could he have done?
Just amazing stuff. It really is. And you look at this and you wonder, how did baseball survive under conditions like that? Because the players weren't given their due, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just amazing. But here's Babe Ruth, who looks at the president of the country in 1930 and says, hey, I made $80,000, and, the president didn't make that much. Well, he had a bad year, in 1930, like the stock market crashed and the depression came on board, and people were having a tough time. But people recognized Babe Ruth was a special case.
Yeah.
You had to treat that guy differently than anyone else because he was the face of baseball. And I'll tell you what, Aaron Judge, I think, is a similar type of guy.
Let's hope.
Well, look at Shohei Ohtani, right? And what the Dodgers have done for him. Mm-hmm. and the way they've structured their deal. So it not only keeps Ohtani forever, but it attracts other ball players now, especially the guys from Japan who were saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a ton of money to be made here. So you can see it almost being a two-edged sword. It cuts both ways. Yeah. And that, as they say, as John Sterling says, and Susan, that's baseball.
Before we wrap up, Dan, there's one thing I did want to, the thing to me in the book that I did not know and that was most interesting to me that I have to ask you about, Jeff, is Albert Spalding gets the contract to supply the baseballs for the National League, but he knows, somebody's just going to come in and undercut me. So I'm actually going to pay them to be the supplier, because being able to be the supplier is worth more to me than anything the National League will pay me to be the supplier.
If that isn't marketing genius, I don't know what is. I'm going to pay these guys to take my product, right? And he wraps up this contract. How long did Spalding sell baseballs to the National League? Well over 100 years. So he dug himself into the National League so deeply that, there was no one who was going to be selling baseballs for a while to the National League. And the great thing about it for Spalding, as you say, is that's his entree to say to the rest of the world, buy the ball that the pros use. Look, everyone's using a Spalding baseball in the National League. Don't you want that? Don't you want to play baseball just like those guys do? And it was just a gold mine for him.
To be honest, the thing it reminded me the most of, because I'm a bit of a fan of the history of professional wrestling, was in the early 80s when Vince McMahon wanted to go national. He would go into the TV stations and they'd say, well, we have this, show that's our highest rated show, and we've been broadcasting it here in Memphis for 40 years. And he'd say, well, what do you pay them? Well, we pay them $1,000 a month. Okay, I'll pay you $1,000 a month to put my show on. And it's like, you kind of leave them with no choice.
There's nothing new in sports.
Exactly.
I mean, they just changed the face of it, but it's all the same stuff.
Exactly.
I wanted, before we close, I want to talk a little bit about their later lives, but I kind of wanted to make another point real quick. One of the interesting things for me is that we're talking about the reserve clause and sort of the rights of the players. The biggest effort of the players from the time the reserve clause is implemented, probably going all the way up till Kurt Flood in the late 1960s, the biggest effort to crush the reserve clause is in 1890 with the formation of the Players League, and you mentioned John Montgomery Ward. The funny thing, and I guess the ironic thing about that, is one of the major forces in killing the Players League is Spalding. And what's interesting to me there is we're talking about a guy who was a former player.
Spalding was above all an organization guy. His whole pitch was, you've got to have an organization that has control. As soon as he went over to the Chicago White Stockings and became part owner and then president of the White Stockings, when William Hulbert, the president of the White Stockings and the National League, died in 1882, Spalding wanted to exercise control as no other guy would or could. And his idea wasn't to make it fair for the players. His idea was to make it fair for him. and everyone else falls into line. And so this whole situation in 1890, it's predictable that it would have happened. If it wasn't John Montgomery Ward, it would be some other, someone who was discontent with the way players were being unfairly treated. Spalding didn't want to hear about that. Spalding wanted the players to fall in line. He had a good thing going with the Chicago White Stockings. He was making money. He was selling sporting goods as well with his company. No disruption of the boat here, please. And he made sure that the players knuckled under in 1890. And really, he not only crushed the Players League, but he crushed the American Association as well. Within 2 years, 3 leagues had gone to 1. And that's what he wanted. As an owner, he said, look, there's an oil monopoly. There's a railroad monopoly. I want that for us. You know, and no one was enforcing the Sherman antitrust thing in the 1890s, and so he went to town on it. Between 1890 and 1892, 3 leagues get compressed to 1, and he viewed that as, well, that's the natural way of baseball, because we started out in 1876 with 1 league, and that's what all this other competition. Well, you know, it's highly overrated.
So let's sort of, as we start to sort of bring it in for a close here, tell me a little bit about their later lives, because Wright lives longer. He lives until, I think, till the late 1930s. Spalding dies much younger, but on the other hand, Wright kind of isn't as involved in baseball in his later life, whereas Spalding is sort of involved, up until the day he dies.
He is.
Tell us a little bit about the later lives of both George Wright and Albert Spalding.
For Albert Spalding, baseball was his life. Baseball made Albert Spalding. Albert Spalding actually, in his early years, tried his hand at a number of different things. He was a bank teller. He was in a grocery business. Every business he touched collapsed. Not because he was in it, but he felt like he was under a cloud. And then he became a baseball player and everything changed. And if you look at his career, it was one step to the next, moving higher and higher within the baseball player ranks, the organization ranks, to being the premier owner and mover and shaker in the National League for so many years. He wanted baseball to be known to everyone as what he thought of it, which was, it's America, it's American values. I want to make sure that everyone looks at this and says, look at a guy like Albert Spalding, who started from nothing, who's become that's the story of America. So his whole thing was about being involved in baseball. Even when he left in the early 1900s, what does he do? He forms the Mills Commission with Abraham Mills, and he goes to prove that baseball was invented by a young guy named Abner Doubleday in 1839 out in a field in Cooperstown, New York, where he draws on the dirt. Here's a diamond. Here are the positions you have. All that was bunk. It just was never so. But for Spalding, the idea was, Here's a military general. Abner Doubleday went through the Civil War and was a decorated hero. Let's fuse the aura of a military hero with baseball. What could be more American than that? And odds are, if you go to ask someone today, who invented baseball? I bet half of the people you ask would say, well, I think it's Abner Doubleday, isn't it? I mean, that's what I've always heard. That myth, that origin myth, was really tough to overthrow. George Wright was an athlete. He wasn't a baseball player. He loved playing baseball, but he was a star cricket player. He played tennis and brought tennis popularity into vogue in the 1880s. He taught his son how to play tennis. His son was a national champion of tennis in the early 1900s, a U.S. Open champion in singles, in doubles. His son, Beals Wright, is in the Tennis Hall of Fame. There is no combination of father in one sport Hall of Fame and son in another sport Hall of Fame. George Wright and his son make up that unique combination. George Wright is known in the Northeast as the father of American golf. Why? Well, he brought golf clubs from Scotland, and a designer who designed clubs and designed golf courses so that people could play on a public links rather than in a country club atmosphere. I mean, George Wright was a guy who wanted people to play and enjoy it. And he wanted to proliferate the number of sports that were out there. So he lived till he was 90 years old, 1937. He missed seeing himself inducted into the Hall of Fame by 2 months. He dies in August of 1937, and a few months later, he's elected to the Hall of Fame. It's just,
the Hall of Fame has a bad tendency to still do that to this day, but at least then they have an excuse that up until the year before that, it didn't really exist. So they can't really bear the brunt of George Wright passing.
That's true. That's true. But these guys were very different in the way they approached sports, yet they were friends for 45 years, had the utmost respect for each other. Just an amazing couple of guys who sold America on baseball and then on sports of all kinds.
Absolutely, and I think that is a good way to close it. That's a good closing statement for the book and for the lives of these two men. The book is called Selling Baseball: How Superstars George Wright and Albert Spalding Impacted Sports in America. Our guest has been the author, Jeff Orens. And Jeff, thanks so much for joining us.
I've really enjoyed it. It's always fun talking about baseball, and you guys really put me through my paces here, so I appreciate it. It's fun.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's what we do. Well, thank you all for joining us yet again, and we'll be back with you before too long with yet another sports history topic. But until then, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. The heel gets the heat. The babyface gets the cheers. But the jobber gets, well, the job done. And speaking of jobbers, Barry Horowitz wasn't there to win titles. He was there to build them. By selling every move, every storyline, and every new star that stepped into the ring. He was the secret sauce. And now, he's the headline in his new book titled Wrestling is My Gimmick, My Life on the Wrong Side of the Three Count. This memoir is a deep dive into wrestling's most underrated position and the man who made it an art form. Whether you're a fan of wrestling, a fan of sports history, or just love a great story, this book is for you. Again, that's Wrestling is My Gimmick by Barry Horowitz. Grab your copy today before the count strikes 3.